And here is the second bad boy among the Julio-Claudians, and he was Nero. Strange man, really. He fashioned himself an artiste. Again, according to I. Claudius, Agrippina poisoned Claudius, her husband. She just couldn't wait for her son to take the throne, knowing that she would become the main person, and she was. She essentially held the empire in her hands for a while until Nero matured, in which case he dispatched her, dispatched his wife, who was also his cousin, dispatched Britannicus, dispatched everybody. When he was adopted by Claudius, he assumed the name Nero Claudius Drusus Germanicus, thus linking himself again to the Augustan line. Mixed, this is Peter Ustinov playing him. Strange mix of paradoxes: artistic, sporting, brutal, weak, sensual, erratic, extravagant, sadistic, and late in life almost certainly deranged. In the first place, he was under the influence of his mother, and then also as he was growing into maturity, he had Seneca, who was a great Stoic philosopher of Rome. He had Seneca as a teacher, and he caused Seneca to commit suicide as well, because he just wanted to be rid of all influences. He wanted to do things himself. So the mother was dispatched, Seneca was dispatched, but for a while the mother and Seneca, in fact, were his influences, things went well. He did have liberal ideas. He considered stopping the gladiatorial games, or at least stopping the killing of the gladiators, and also often these gladiatorial games were essentially execution of criminals, because instead of executing criminals, they were just allowed to go into the arena without any protective armor or any weapons. So it was just essentially execution. So he was considering stopping that as well, but all of that remained consideration. But as I said, once he came to maturity, he got rid of all the influences, the mother, Seneca, and devoting himself more and more to singing, acting, horse racing, did the unimaginable, performed in the theater. Sexual exploits, of course. One of the events that's connected with him is the Great Fire of Rome in the year 64 AD. The thing is that there were huge fires, always. I mean, there'll be another huge fire in the year 80. There were fires before that, because when we talked about city planning, Rome was built hopscotch, and there were no preventive measures. Augustus was the first, remember, that built that wall, the fire preventive concrete wall around his forum. But the fire destroyed a great chunk of the city. The story about Nero playing violin, well, for the one thing, there was no such thing as a violin at the time. Then other sources maintain that Nero wasn't even in the city at the time. Well, but it did happen during his reign. And in fact, but afterwards, he actually received and deserved praises for handling it, because the city planning came into being under Nero, and he was very interested in methodical solution of the problem and building housing for those who were deprived of it, and instituting again a fire brigade and various other methods to contain disasters in the future. But he also appropriated an enormous chunk of land for himself, for his own personal palace, and that overshadowed his efforts for the good of the public. This is one of the coins again, and this shows him and his mother, in fact, Agrippina. This is when he was still very young, and Agrippina held command, and there are a number of coins even where Agrippina stands in front of him in a more powerful position. Head of Nero. There's no idealization here. In fact, the hair is kind of all over, and he has a a short beard even, which Romans did not do. And his face is puffy and in fact looks somewhat decadent. So that is compared to his early portraits. This shows a development that did not take in consideration idealization. He built an arch which does not remain, but we can judge of it by the coins. It's tripartite in terms of design, but it's only a one-way arch. And on the sides, instead of in fact a walkway or a carriageway, there were enormous statues, perhaps of Mars and Venus, we don't know. And then what's also interesting is that the columns in front of the arch are in fact actual columns, not engaged. And as a result, both the base and the entablature projects forward and sinks backwards, creating a very interesting play, again, light and dark, and with statuary on top. So that is interesting. That's something new, again, something that we had not seen before. In a huge chunk of land that had burned, he appropriated that land for his own purposes and built a huge palace there. And that palace, parts of this palace were gilded, which is why it came to be known as the Golden House, the Domus Aurea of Nero. It was really huge. It included several buildings connected by monumental porticoed roads, and there he also had an enormous statue of himself cast in bronze and gilded with his own face, and was something like 120 feet. It had a huge, enormous lake where naval battles could be performed. Swimming, of course, the baths, everything was there. Everything was part of the Golden House. Here is what this statue may have looked like. It doesn't exist anymore. But when this house was in fact destroyed, a statue was left, just the features were reworked, and he was made into a sun god. And he stood right next to the next building of importance that we'll look at, the Coliseum. But originally, Coliseum was not called Coliseum, it was called something else. And the reason it is called Coliseum today is because of the colossal statue of Nero that was next to it, not because the building itself is colossal, even though it is. Here is just, these are all the buildings of the house. It was enormous. And it's not that other emperors didn't have tremendous villas. They did, but they were elsewhere. They were not in Rome. They all had summer villas and the villas on the Bay of Naples, and they were very large, very extensive, with bathhouses, with what have you. But no one saw them because they were all outside of Rome. This Nero built right inside where everyone could see it. There are all these yellow parts. That's where the house was. Today, I mean, the building was, as I said, taken down by the following emperor. But today one can still go in, and one of the most interesting spaces there is the central hall. This is possibly what it looks like. Some of the dining rooms had devices in the ceilings that could spray perfume on the sitters, and in the central dome there was a device where a lining of the dome, I suppose, could in fact rotate with the sun. The revolutionary nature of this kind of design could not be possible without cement, or concrete rather. Because the Greeks essentially they limited space. They delineated space with their rectilinear structures. Romans began to sculpt space with the use of concrete. So this is our central hall, and the dome that is above the central hall. I mean, it's octagonal, but then the octagons smooth out into a circular shape right here. And then there were 5 spaces that extended from the room, and then the 3 obliquely or directly faced the outside. Two of these spaces were in fact covered with groin vaults, which is one of the earliest usage of groin vaulting. But by themselves, they were unremarkable. What was remarkable is the central hall, really quite extraordinary. And you may remember the arch. This is our basic Roman arch, and if the arch extends, it can create a barrel vault, or if two barrel vaults intersect one another, then a groin vault is created where all the masses, all the weight of the groin is then directed not into the walls, but into very, very massive piers. But however, leaving the four spaces on each side, on the four cardinal spaces open for light, for walking, whatever. So it's a much more open construction than the barrel vault. So that's one, and then and here it is. So if one arch is extended to create a barrel vault, then with the use of concrete, it can then be simulated and manipulated rather into various shapes, or turned on itself, it creates a dome. So that's what happened in Nero's palace. It was discovered sometime in the Renaissance, I think. Again, a boy, a shepherd, fell through, found himself in a space, and where the walls were covered with these extraordinary frescoes that looked mythological, that looked mysterious, and as a result, this type of decoration came to be known as grotesques, because they were found in the grottos of Nero's palace. And here's an example. This is what they look like, these grotesques. They're very, very beautiful. They're very fantastical. Ultimately, Rome rebelled, and it was felt that here's another madman on the throne, and the Senate finally condemned the emperor to be flogged to death. When Nero heard about it, he committed suicide. Presumably his last words before he committed suicide: "What an artist the world loses in me." The year, or rather a year and a half, after his death, it was just one general after another was proclaimed emperor by the troops. Once the troops began to proclaim, it began with Claudius, remember, the troops, the Praetorian Guard, the Imperial Guard, proclaimed him as emperor. After that, the troops will, particularly later on in the 3rd century, the troops will be proclaiming their generals as emperors. So Nero died in June 68, then you have Galba, Otto, and Vitellius, December 69, so a year and a half. And if you count Vespasian, there will be 5. Galba was a governor of Spain, and here's his sestertius, there's his coin, and they all were very anxious immediately to mint coins, because that's the only way that the empire knows that you're emperor. And Galba, in fact, did not idealize himself at all. Here is his aquiline nose, very powerful, very strong chin, certainly not a young man, and he wished, it was almost returned to the Republican values, very much wished to show himself as a powerful general. Didn't last long. Then the next one was Otto for 3 months. So he allied himself with Galba at first, then rebelled against him. Immediately again minted the money. There's even a bust of him. The reason we really don't have much of these emperors is because every succeeding emperor would recall the money, of course, and would destroy the busts that were made of his predecessor. It was called the damning of memory, damnation memoriae, and it will happen more and more in Rome. In fact, with Caligula, it happened with Caligula. After Caligula was killed, much of what was associated with him was destroyed, and some of the statuary was recut to represent another person. And so, but that's what the damning of memory is. So that's why we don't have too much of that. And then there was Vitellius, who was presumably something close to 7 feet tall. He was an enormous man, huge. And again, did not hide it as you see it from the portrait. And it says here on the basis of its resemblance to numismatic portraits. That's how the identification is made, because sometimes one obviously, well, how do they know? One wonders. But yes, forensic experts called upon, and all sorts of numismatic evidence, and then comparison of different examples. So there was this year of 4 generals, and none of them lasted. And then finally, a very successful general by the name of Vespasian, of the Flavian family. The last name was Flavian, and he established the new dynasty. So it was no longer the Julio-Claudians. The Julio-Claudians was, well, Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. 6. So those, and then we'll have 3 of the Flavians, essentially Vespasian and his 2 sons. And Vespasian was a very successful general, and he was a very straightforward, very basic values man. I mean, absolutely no luxury to him, no decadence, a true Roman with the true Roman virtues. And he and his son Titus were engaged in Palestine, and Jerusalem was ultimately destroyed in the year 70 by Titus, by the son of Vespasian. Before that, as you saw, in 68, Nero commits suicide, and then a year and a half follows when all these different generals become emperors. Vespasian waits his moment. That's when he proceeds to Rome, defeats Vitellius, and proclaimed emperor in his own right, while Titus stays back in Jerusalem and ultimately razes to the ground. The 3 of them ruled altogether for 27 years. And he was a very good ruler. He, again, reformed, I mean, the financial system Claudius reformed, but it needed to be reformed all the time, because, of course, Nero abused it horrifically. Reformed the financial system, began building, he is the one who began building the Coliseum. And that's why that building was called originally the Flavian Amphitheater, because it was built by the Flavians. It will be Titus who will inaugurate it, but it's Vespasian face, and Vespasian's name is connected to Coliseum. And through his general Agricola, he expanded Rome's rule in Britain. What he did with the Colosseum is that he realized that what Nero did was indefensible, taking so much land from the people. So as a result, he was the one who destroyed the palace of Nero. He drained the lake, and it's on the site of the lake that the Colosseum was built. And then his son Titus built public baths there, and then public housing where the palace was. But the grottos remain, and that's where the boy fell into one of those grottos, into Nero's grotto. The Flavians will build their own palace, and it will be enormous as well, but it will be up on the Palatine, where imperial palaces were located, so that was all right. Both of these are portraits of Vespasian, and they I mean, while similar, they do look somewhat different. Small eyes, sort of closely placed to the nose, very determined chin, and no nonsense face. And this is Vespasian and his son Titus, which, I mean, the son is obviously a much younger face, but similar features. Vespasian was emperor 10 years, and then after him came Titus. And Vespasian, Titus, Domitian afterwards, the next brother, they all made Togate portraits, full portraits of themselves. And the difference between these 2 portraits is that under Titus, now so we are 70 years away from Augustus, almost 3/4 of a century, the cutting is deeper. The cutting is considerably deeper in the folds compared to this, and as a result, the play of light and dark is more pronounced than it was under Augustus. Titus, 2.5 years he ruled. It's something odd because I mean, he survived those extremely challenging campaigns in Palestine under heat and rain and storms, and then he comes home and he dies at a young age. So there's and because his brother Domitian was very much in the same group as Caligula and Nero, a maniac. There is a suspicion that Domitian, in fact, poisoned his brother to assume the rule, which is possible. So Titus is known for destroying the Jewish temple. So when one hears about the destruction of the temple in the year 70 AD, that was under Titus, and then the Jews were not still expelled from Jerusalem. That will happen under Hadrian, but the temple of Jupiter will be erected where the Jewish temple used to be. And as emperor, I mean, he was an intelligent, moderate emperor who continued in the footsteps of his father, and of course he is very much known for finishing the Coliseum. This is a lovely painting by Lawrence Almatadema, who was one of the pre-Raphaelites, and it shows the triumph of when Titus came back from Palestine. He was given a triumph, and so in front you see Vespasian, who is still very much alive, and then behind is Titus wearing his golden armor for his triumph. He is holding the hand of his daughter Julia, and she is turning around to talk to another brother, the brother who is Domitian, and who has his hood over his head, which means that he did officiate, in fact, at the steps of the temple of Jupiter that you see at the back. Again, Titus was only emperor for two and a half years, and then came Domitian, who will in fact be there for 15 years and will be assassinated. He's the last member of the Flavian dynasty, and his rule was very authoritarian, very despotic, hated the Vestal virgins. Under him, how many Vestal virgins were put to death? At least 3?
4.
4. Yeah. And that's out of 6. There are only 6 of them, or 7 with the head Vestal. But for whatever reason, he just blamed the Vestals for anything that went wrong. He did revalue the Roman coinage and strengthen the economy, and initiated a building program, but then they all loved building. And architect was regarded as somewhat with his own numen, so to speak, with his own divine powers, just as God is a creator, so is an architect. There was something about architecture that very much appealed to the ruling classes, and the mission was not different from that. As you see this statue, the statue actually goes down. It's a nude bust as opposed to a togate bust, and this also began with Domitian. It's not that his neck is that long, it's just he's not wearing a toga to cover his shoulders. In 96 he was assassinated and condemned to oblivion, and then I mean, we know about these emperors from Tacitus, and then Suetonius, of course, wrote his 12 emperors, so we know much about that. So authors Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Suetonius portrayed Domitian as a cruel and paranoid tyrant. So, and that's the image that we have. So here's the father Vespasian, Titus, who very much followed in his footsteps in terms of his policies, and then the black sheep, the Domitian. It is during the Flavians, I mean, we talked about the women's coiffure. It was during the Flavians that these very elaborate hairstyles became popular. But the moment you see a hairdo like this, you just know it's the end of the 1st century, because that's of the 1st century AD, because that's when they were popular. And here is how it may have looked like when painted. Again, the tremendous skill would be needed in drilling all that stone. At the same time, older women were also portrayed, also with elaborate hair, not as elaborate. And here it's almost a Republican portrait. They also did the nudes with that kind of hair, And the nudes, as you see, they go back to Praxiteles and Venus de Milo. Praxiteles is the 4th century, Venus de Milo 2nd century BC, and here is the end of the 1st century AD, where you see essentially the same idea, and here her garment, actually it's dropped considerably lower than that of the Venus de Milo, and it serves as a column for the whole statue. So no support is needed. The garment itself is the support. And thus we come to Coliseum, which is really the most important building that was erected by the Flavians. As I said, it began with Vespasian, who destroyed the palace of Nero, and yes, there must have been absolute wonders of painting and decoration in that palace. And on the site of the lake was drained, but presumably a source of water remained, because according to Cassius, according to one of the later Roman historians, there was a possibility to flood, in fact, the floor of the Coliseum in order to conduct the naval games in small vessels, of course. But then other historians doubt that it happened. We don't have eyewitnesses. The only record we have is from someone who lived later. Here's the original Coliseum. That's what it looked like. This is what it looks like today. When it was inaugurated under Titus, inaugurational games lasted 3 months, and 9,000 wild beasts were slain. We don't know how many men, thousands and thousands, needless to say. This is the time, because you see, with the gladiatorial games, I mean, the gladiator could in fact have a long and successful career and then retire, because, I mean, technically a gladiator, especially a good one, was very expensive. So the owners of gladiatorial schools were not keen on having their men killed. So as a result, a lot of gladiatorial games did not presuppose the demise of the entertainers. But of course here, when something was as important as that, yes, then men were of course killed. Reason the Colosseum is in such a dreadful shape, in fact the entire Roman Forum, is because in the 16th century, 15th century, 16th century, when presumably, which was a Renaissance, the revival of classical antiquity, and men and women were supposedly enamored with everything classical, but for whatever reason they did not regard the Colosseum or the Roman Forum as something worth preserving, and as a result used stone and marble from the Colosseum, from the Roman Forum, in order to build their own buildings. So they used the Roman Forum and the Colosseum as a quarry, and which is why it's all completely stripped of its stone. This is what it looks like today. Here's the cavea. The seats were supported by all the structures. Underneath, this is the level of the original floor, and underneath there were rooms and rooms and endless spaces to keep the animals, to keep the gladiators, to keep the machinery that brought up props and what have you that was needed for the spectacles. Here's still another picture of it from up above, and a reconstruction of possible engineering devices that brought the animals up. There would be a cage, and the animals would come out of the cages into the lifts. The lifts would then be brought up, and then the animals emerge onto the surface. A brilliant painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme, which is called Police Verso, which is thumb down. The Vestal Virgin sat right next to the imperial box. So here they are, and they seem to demand the death of the poor devil here. Actually, this is the painting that inspired the film Gladiator. It was all faced with beautiful limestone, and then the lower seats that were designated for aristocracy were lined in marble. As I said, all of that was stripped later on, because it's set in a valley rather than a natural hillside. A cavea, the support for the cavea had to be built. The entire the foundation is all done, all of it in cement. And then as the building went up, these radial barrel vaulting cavities were constructed right here that held up the seats. And there were 4 levels, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And as in the Theatre Marcellus, that was constructed about 70 years earlier, each level was decorated with a different style of architecture. So the engaged columns here, they're Doric, therefore the most durable, the powerful ones. The Doric order is on the first level, then the second level is Ionic order, then the third level is Corinthian order, and then the fourth here is Corinthian also, but pilasters as opposed to engaged columns. Now these structures here, these wooden poles, were up from them rolled the canopy to hide the public from either sun or rain. And so here is another idea. So from these you see they were attached to the poles that held the canopy right here. And in between, in the arches, it was all beautiful sculpture, all beautiful statuary. Here's still another idea of how it was made, and the sitting was hierarchical. So senators and their wives, knights and their wives, then plebeians, and then up above the women, the poor, the slaves were allowed. They all sat up there. At the top. Here's another picture of what those canopies looked like, and still another one. In fact, there are stone stumps today around the Coliseum, that served where devices were attached to those stumps that operated the canopy, and it was operated by the sailors, because the sailors, of course, were used to this sort of work. Here's still another, there are a ton of pictures of Coliseum. There's the canopy right there that is folded between the poles, and here's a statue of Nero. As I said, originally the Coliseum was called the Flavian Amphitheater, and then with time, because the statue was so colossal, the whole thing was called the Colosseum. Here's an example of some of the games, and as you see, the props were very realistic. They would build the mountains, the rivers, the what have you, and they would say they would want to recreate the battle between Aeneas and Turnus. They could do that, and then they would then create the ancient Alba Longa, for instance, and the hills of Rome, and that's what you see. And then the battle would take place, but for real. It's essentially a Yankee stadium, so everything was brilliantly organized, and there were several entrances around that people had their tickets, and the tickets specified the seat, and that's where they proceeded. So it was all very well organized. This an imaginative drawing of when the Colosseum presumably was flooded, so that the naval battle took place, but we don't know whether it really happened. So Colosseum was a tremendous building at the time. Another building that survived today actually is the Ark of Titus, that was built by Domitian. Killed them, but then glorified them. And the Ark still stands in the Roman Forum. It is very close to the Colosseum, so one to enter the Forum from the Colosseum side, one would pass through the Ark, and on both sides of the arch, right here, this just says that the Senate of and the Roman people erected this arch in great memory of Emperor Titus. So on each side here, there are reliefs, as you see. The painting is actually by American painters. Collaboration between Healy, Frederick Church, and Jervis McEntee. Here, you see, I think, is is Longfellow, the poet, with his daughter, and here are the three painters. So as I said, this arch is built very close to the Coliseum, so you see the Coliseum through the arch. Both sides, as you walk through, are sculpted with historical reliefs. And this time these are the historical reliefs, first of the capture of Jerusalem, and second of the triumphal procession of Titus. And then up above is the so-called apotheosis of Titus, where the eagle bears him towards heaven after his death. So we'll look at them. So on the one side, what we see here is the capture of the Temple of Jerusalem and carrying away of its tremendous treasures. In fact, the temple was so wealthy that it is said that it's possible that the money that was used for the building of the Coliseum came from the Temple of Jerusalem. So what you see here, well, you see the menorah right here. It takes at least 4 men, maybe. Oh no, 4 on each side, 8 men to carry it. It's all pure gold, and it's done interestingly. It's done. The men first are done in low relief, and then as they come around, they are in higher relief. So there's an arc that they follow, and then goes through the triumphal arch, and presumably these are all the spoils that are carried during triumphal procession. And it's not in a very good shape, but the fact that they have it at all is quite extraordinary. And then opposite that is the triumphal procession itself, with Titus Triumphant. As you see here, it's a little awkward because the horses are portrayed in the four stallions, white stallions, presumably are portrayed in profile, whereas the chariot with Titus himself are done frontal. So as the horses turn, presumably the chariot will turn as well. While the other relief is they're mortal men carrying the lute. Here, however, Titus is directed. The horses are led by Allegory of Victory. So here, men and gods are together. And the same thing, some of the relief is low relief, and then the horses, the reason their front legs didn't survive was because they were essentially sculptured in the round, and as a result they fell off. So there's, no, this is, did I say victory? No, victory is behind him, crowning him, right there, because she's winged. This is the allegory of Rome, of Roma. She welcomes Titus. There's no longer a slave telling him that he is not a god. There's actually the goddess Victory who is crowning him with the wreath. So those two, and then, as I said, in the soffit at the very top, right here is Titus being carried off, being borne by the eagle up towards heaven. You can't see it very well here, but again, let's go to a drawing. So here's the eagle, as you see, and bearing Titus up. Domitian was assassinated ultimately, and his memory was damned. But before that happened, he did build a tremendous palace on the Palatine Hill. And I mean, we talked about the Roman houses. This was tremendous. It consisted actually of 3 buildings, and the official building, the most important building, instead of the atrium that we're used to walk into the atrium with the impluvium. So no, we have now a huge audience hall, and that in itself consists of 3 parts. There is the audience hall in the front, sort of like a basilica, with an apse there where the emperor would sit on the raised platform, receiving visitors. And then there's another basilica right here, and presumably still another on the other side. Then you'll have a colonnaded peristyle and a triclinium. I mean, the basic principle is the same, and the the purpose of the rooms is the same. It's just that it's all done now on the gigantic scale, and never mind the first Pompeian style, attempting to give an impression of various stones. These were marbles and basalts and diorites and all the most lapis lazuli, all the beautiful stones that could be gotten were used here. And then what you see here, number 5, those were the nymphaeums, which are fountains. Nymphaeums were fountains because the nymphs presumably played and appreciated beautiful fountain structures. And that's what he had. That's his palace. So there's the Coliseum right there. This is where Nero's palace was. This is the house constructed by Domitian right there on the Palatine Hill. So from here he could actually watch the races down below in the Hippodrome without having, I mean, he had his imperial box there as well, of course, but he didn't have to. They could just watch there. And Pompeian Theater, Theater of Marcellus, and you can look around, and there's the Temple of Jupiter, the Roman Forum, and these are the imperial forums. The actual house that the mission constructed consisted of 3 houses. One was the house we just looked at, the Domus Flavia, the Flavian house. Then next to it, there was the personal rooms and area of the family, and it was called Domus Augustana. Not the Augustus's house is to the left here, and that's the Temple of Apollo that he built. But Domus Augustana was the family quarters. And then he had his own kind of little stadium built there as well, which was a garden. It was not big enough, large enough for any significant games. And this is the Circus Maximus. This is the Hippodrome right beneath, because all of this is up on the hill, on the Palatine Hill, and then you can look behind. And here again, there it is. And so here is the house itself for official reception. Then the private quarters, and there is the garden. And from here he could watch the games. Still just another picture there. That's all his house, and he's watching the games. The Hippodrome was built sort of like the Coliseum also. The cavia had to sit on these radial structures of barrel vaulting structures that could hold up the weight, as you see here. These are recreations of the games. One of the most extraordinary, probably the most extraordinary example of the chariot racing that you can ever see is in Ben-Hur. In Ben-Hur, a film that was made in 1959, and Charlton Heston races. The whole Hippodrome was constructed, I think in Italy they did it. And it was all, I mean, none of it is computer animated, obviously. If you ever want to see the actual horse racing, ancient horse racing, watch that film. Another 19th century painter whom I love, he's Spanish, his name is Ulpiano Checa, and it's just that 19th century was so swept away with Impressionism and then everything that came after Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Expressionism, that tremendous artists were completely forgotten and not paid attention to, but one of them is in fact Ulpiano Checa, and that's his rendering. And here's, he did several of those. This is in color, I actually like the black and white better. But renderings of, I don't know who I suspect that's also Ulpiano Checa, because the style is, speaking of styles, the style is very similar. Back to the house. These are the races that one can watch from the house. Here we're back to the house again. And here is the Nymphaeum. Ever since Nero, ever since this shaping of space with either a circular architecture or concave and convex, they just went to town with it, the Romans. And from concrete, then they started doing in brick, especially when there's small structures like that. But we also have to remember that all of that was faced, probably with marble in this case. Also, just imagine water everywhere. Beautiful fountains, beautiful sculpture, all of it. And this was on each side. Here, there it is, and then there's another one on the other side. And on each side of triclinium. This is the official dining room. And this is his essentially a sunken garden, that because it is the same shape as the Hippodrome, it's called Domitian Stadium, but it was in fact a sunken garden, and Domitian loved that kind of shape. Again, imagine statuary, imagine water, imagine just beautiful, beautiful paintings everywhere, mosaics. Still another garden, a peristyle garden, still concave and convex shapes. And then an actual stadium that he built is what Piazza Navona is today. The Piazza Navona, which is one of the most spectacular places in Rome, is built on top of those seats of the Domitian Stadium. And here it is. This is Piazza Navona, and as you see, one end of it is half a circle and the other is straight, because that's how the stadium, and there's your stadium, that's what the stadium used to be, right here. And this is the comparison between, and it's called Domitian Stadium today. This is the stadium, this is Piazza Navona. And right here, there's a museum. One can go downstairs and see the foundations, the cement foundations upon which the whole stadium sat. Quite fascinating. Again, this is our Domitian Palace, the Palatine, the Circus Maximus, the greatest hippodrome. And then there's the Domitian Hippodrome right there. And that's Piazza Navona today. After he was assassinated, his memory too was condemned. Damnatio memoriae, the damning of memory. And we are at the very end of the 1st century, and the Senate now, not the army, the Senate now chose an elderly man with impeccable record among themselves, and whose name was Marcus Cocius Nerva, and then Caesar Augustus. He only ruled for 2 years, and then he died. But what is interesting is that most of the sculpture that Domitian commissioned, or was commissioned under Domitian with his face, was recut with the face of Nerva. He also, Domitian also built a forum called the Domitian Forum, which was renamed as Nerva Forum at first, and then because of its shape, this is, you see the Forum of Augustus, remember? This is the Forum of Augustus, this is the Forum of Julius Caesar, and then right here is the Roman Forum. But this essentially was a narrow way that led from Subura, the area where poor population lived, but it lived from the Subura to the Roman Forum, to the Forum of Julius Caesar and Augustan Forum. And as a result, it came to be known as Forum Transitorum, where one transits from one place to another. So as you see, it was very narrow. This is the Forum of Augustus. And because it was so narrow, there could not be a bona fide colonnaded walkway on the side. So what was done instead, the column was projected away from the wall. It was a full column, right here, here and there. And then the entablature, as you see, projected together with it. And very often on top there would be sculpture, and then sculpture here. Everything is everything decorated. Here it is. Here's the if you may understand it better how the whole thing was built. It still created a beautiful, beautiful impression of colonnaded porticos, and then at the end was a temple dedicated to Minerva. As I said, unquestionably there were probably signs at first that it was a Domitian forum, but then all those names were eliminated. It was the Forum of Nerva, but it came to be known in practice as Forum Transitorum because it was so narrow. We are fortunate to have some reliefs survive because they were just discarded essentially, and one is the coming of Vespasian in the year 70 A.D. and then the leaving of Domitian for some other campaign. So Vespasian and Domitian, actually, Domitian is meeting him because Vespasian came by himself. Remember, Titus was left in Palestine to keep fighting with the Judeans, where's the mission, that this is his moment of glory. He is welcoming his father. And he, for some reason, was not recut. He's right here. Whereas in this one, when Domitian himself is leaving Rome, there he is recut. His face is very specific, so you cannot confuse it. And then there are gods. Now again, men and gods mixed together, and Domitian is welcoming. And here is Domitian, who is leaving Rome on some of his campaigns, and his face is recut to resemble that of Nerva. Here is, and as a result, it looks very small, you see. This head is smaller than others because it was recut, and here, here's the face, this is what's recut. And just the last example of the same damnatio memoriae, it's an equestrian statue in bronze of Domitian languishing an enemy. There was an enemy at one point under the horse's hooves, but the front part of the face was in fact cut off from the bronze image and recast as Nerva. And thus we come to the end of the first century. Just to summarize, it began very much with classicizing tendencies under Augustus, because Augustus very much wanted to return the whole attitude of the Romans not only to their basic values, but also wished for Rome to become the next Athens or the next Alexandria, something as gorgeous as those other classical cities. So there's a lot of classicizing, a lot of idealizing we see in portraiture and classicizing in architecture. And then already by the time of Claudius, there's experimentation, as we saw with introducing undressed stone in the streets of Rome itself, and then cutting deeper into the marble to create more sort of Baroque sense of the light and dark. And then the next step under the Flavians, desire for external display is very much in evidence, even with the hair, the female hair. And then, of course, that's when we have the Coliseum built presumably on the funds of looted temple of Jerusalem. And we will start with the 2nd century AD next time.